On a misty October morning in 1823, the people of Charleston County, South Carolina, awoke to a discovery that would stain their town's history for generations. 7 enslaved people had disappeared overnight from the Ravenscraft plantation, leaving behind only their broken shackles and a single blood-stained document sealed with the mark of Colonel Thaddeus Ravenscraft. What investigators uncovered within that letter exposed a network of deceit, greed, and deliberate cruelty that reached deep into the heart of Southern high society. For nearly 200 years, the Ravenscraft family has spent immense fortunes trying to erase every trace of this event. But newly unearthed letters have revealed the horrifying truth behind what would come to be known as the Wedding Gift Massacre. The Colonel's gift to his bride would not only doom his own bloodline, it would forever alter the balance of power across the region. Before we delve into the chilling tale of Colonel Thaddeus Ravenscraft and his deadly wedding promise, be sure to subscribe for more forgotten tales of darkness in American history. And let us know in the comments which city or state you're listening from. We love hearing from those who share our fascination with the hidden corners of the past. The surviving document from that dreadful night was later described by Charleston's mayor as the most damning record of human calculation I have ever seen. But to grasp its meaning, we must first return to the world from which this nightmare was born. Charleston County in 1822 embodied everything the antebellum South aspired to become. Vast cotton fields rolled like green oceans across the countryside, their profits fueling magnificent mansions that lavish parties that mirrored the splendor of European nobility. Among the plantation aristocracy, few names carried as much weight as Colonel Thaddeus Ravenscraft's. His distinguished service during the War of 1812 had brought him both honor and substantial government land grants. Ravenscraft was a man of precision, a born strategist. Towering over 6 feet tall, with sharp gray eyes and a meticulously trimmed beard, he exuded command wherever he stood. His deep voice demanded obedience, whether from soldiers under his command or the 200 enslaved laborers toiling on his vast cotton estate. Those who knew him spoke of unyielding discipline and relentless ambition. The same traits that built his empire and, ironically, led to his downfall. The Ravenscraft plantation spanned more than 3,000 acres of fertile South Carolina land, worked by enslaved families who had served the household for generations. Unlike many planters who treated their slaves purely as assets, Ravenscraft meticulously documented every detail of their lives, their skills, families, health, and, most chillingly, their market value, which he recalculated monthly based on age and ability. His betrothed, Miss Cordelia Petton of Savannah, hailed from one of Georgia's most respected families. At just 23, she possessed both the refined grace of a Southern belle and a sizable inheritance that would significantly expand Ravenscraft's wealth. Their engagement, announced in spring 1822, was celebrated as a flawless union between military prestige and old plantation fortune. But beneath the veneer of Southern gentility, Cordelia harbored ambitions far beyond the expected duties of a wife. During their carefully supervised courtship, afternoon strolls and polite parlor visits, she displayed an unsettling fascination with the business side of plantation life. While other women discussed social affairs and domestic matters, Cordelia pressed Thaddeus for details on harvest yields, labor systems, and profit margins. Intrigued by her intellect, Ravenscraft began sharing financial information usually reserved for male peers. What emerged was a woman whose brilliance rivaled her beauty, yet whose moral sense had been corroded by a lifetime surrounded by wealth built on exploitation. Her father, Horatio Petton, had made his fortune not only in cotton, but in the interstate slave trade. Cordelia had grown up in a world where human beings were bartered and bred like livestock, where empathy was weakness and commerce ruled all. Their wedding, planned for October 1822, was destined to be the grandest social event of the year. Invitations spread from Virginia to Louisiana. The Colonel spared no expense, importing French champagne, hiring musicians from New Orleans, and ordering custom English china embossed with the Ravenscraft and Petton crests. But as the celebration drew near, Cordelia made a request that would set a catastrophic series of events into motion. During a private dinner in September, she asked her fiancé for a gift no Southern bride had ever dared to request: complete ownership and control over 7 specific, enslaved people from his plantation. The conversation took place in the Colonel's private study, a room lined with military maps, family portraits, and detailed ledgers chronicling his empire. Outside, thunder rolled over the endless cotton fields as Cordelia spoke with disarming calm, her tone more suited to discussing table settings than human lives. "My dear Thaddeus," she began, her voice steady yet unnervingly firm, "I have been thinking of how I might best contribute to our household's prosperity once we are wed. I believe I can offer more to our future than you might expect." Ravencroft listened in uneasy silence as his bride to be unfolded a plan so coldly logical it sent a chill through the room. She requested full legal ownership of 7 specific enslaved individuals, a single family composed of parents, 3 adult children, and 2 grandchildren. They were to be transferred entirely into her possession, free from her husband's oversight, with documents ensuring her exclusive authority. Her reasoning, she explained, was both practical and profitable. "These 7 represent an ideal test group," Cordelia said calmly, opening a leather-bound portfolio filled with meticulous notes. "The elder pair possess valuable expertise in blacksmithing and weaving. Their children, one woman skilled in healing with herbs and another man with great physical strength, are invaluable labor assets, and the younger 2 are impressionable enough to be shaped by new methods I've been studying." What she didn't immediately confess was the true nature of those methods. Through private correspondence with plantation owners in Cuba and Brazil, Cordelia had learned of management systems considered too cruel even by antebellum Southern norms. These practices relied on deliberate psychological manipulation, selective breeding, and punishment regimes designed to shatter both individual will and familial connection, ensuring complete submission. Ravencroft found himself in unfamiliar territory. Cordelia's request defied every convention of Southern marriage and property law. Wives might oversee household servants, but independent ownership of field laborers was unheard of, especially under such experimental terms. Yet, despite his initial discomfort, her ambition intrigued him. Cotton prices were volatile, and planters across the South were desperate to improve efficiency. If her methods proved effective, they could be expanded to his entire workforce, revolutionizing labor management and potentially multiplying profits. Over the following weeks, the couple refined what they called the Peton method, a system designed to maximize both productivity and obedience among the enslaved. The 7 chosen individuals would serve as the first test subjects, their behavior observed and recorded in secret. Success, they agreed, would lead to its adoption across the entire plantation after their marriage. The legal process required extraordinary care. Ravencroft enlisted the services of Marcus Bellwether, a Charleston attorney renowned for his absolute discretion in delicate plantation affairs. Bellwether drafted the necessary documents transferring full ownership of the 7 to Cordelia upon marriage, with clauses ensuring the arrangement remained hidden from other landowners and local officials. But one clause stood out, a condition Cordelia herself demanded. The 7 individuals were to be relocated to a secluded section of the property, far from the main quarters, where her experiments could proceed without observation. A small structure, outwardly resembling a textile workshop, would serve as both their housing and the site for implementing her new techniques. As October drew near, Ravencroft convinced himself that Cordelia's unorthodox request represented not cruelty, but visionary thinking. His entire fortune had been built on calculated risk and shrewd innovation, qualities he now admired in his future wife. Their marriage, he believed, would transcend the bounds of romance or status. It would be a partnership built to reshape plantation economics across the South. Neither could have foreseen how quickly their secret would spread beyond their circle of confidence. Rumors whispered among servants and merchants soon reached ears uninvited, and from those whispers began a sequence of events that would turn their wedding day into a nightmare. October 15, 1822, dawned with a clear, golden light that made Charleston County shimmer like paradise. The Ravencroft estate had been transformed into a vision of celebration. White silk ribbons draped along the oak-lined drive, banquet tables glittering with silver and crystal under the autumn sun. More than 200 guests arrived by carriage, forming a procession that stretched for miles down the rural road. The guest list read like a registry of Southern power. Governor Richardson attended, along with senators, judges, and planters whose combined fortunes could sway state and federal decisions. The ceremony unfolded in the garden pavilion, Cordelia radiant in imported French silk, Ravenscraft magnificent in his decorated military uniform. But the moment that would etch this day into infamy came later, during the presentation of the wedding gifts. In keeping with tradition, the groom was to declare his offering publicly before all assembled guests. Ravenscraft had planned the announcement with great care, knowing it would be discussed from Virginia to Louisiana. As the crowd gathered, he raised his glass and called for silence. His voice carried across the manicured garden, rich with confidence and pride. "My dear friends," he began, unaware that the words he spoke next would mark the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in South Carolina's history. It is traditional for a groom to present his bride with jewels, fine gowns, or perhaps a carriage, Ravenscraft declared, his tone measured and proud. But my beloved Cordelia has asked for something far more practical, something that speaks to progress and innovation. The gathered crowd leaned in with fascination as the colonel described his unconventional wedding gift, the legal transfer of 7 enslaved individuals, carefully selected for their range of abilities and potential for what he called advanced management practices. He praised Cordelia's intelligence, her modern thinking, and her commitment to improving plantation efficiency through new labor systems. To the guests, his words painted a portrait of an enlightened union, an esteemed officer honoring a wife eager to contribute to the prosperity of their estate. What none of them realized was that, even as they applauded, those 7 individuals were being torn from their families and taken to a remote part of the property where Cordelia's experiments would begin the moment the celebration ended. The reactions among the guests were mixed, though generally favorable. Several prominent planters approached Ravenscraft throughout the evening, intrigued by the notion of their wives managing enslaved workers as an extension of household responsibility. Many saw it as a forward-thinking response to the South's changing economic climate. Yet not all were charmed by the display. Dr. Edmund Fitzgerald, the county physician who often treated enslaved workers, was unsettled by Ravenscraft's cold, analytical tone, his references to people as test subjects for management systems. Reverend Samuel Hartwell, who ministered to many of the attending families, felt an instinctive unease at hearing marriage and morality so casually entwined with human suffering. As the night deepened and the champagne flowed freely, Cordelia herself joined the discussions, offering chillingly casual remarks about her theories. She spoke brightly about breaking unhealthy family attachments that reduce labor efficiency and creating psychological conditions for complete obedience. Her words, delivered with a smile and genteel grace, were met with polite laughter rather than alarm, a testament to how deeply cruelty had been normalized among the Southern elite. The festivities continued for 3 days, endless feasts, dancing under lantern light, and toasts that would later be remembered as part of one of the grandest weddings Charleston County had ever seen. Yet while music and laughter filled the mansion, dark work had already begun deep in the woods, where Cordelia's new property faced the start of her horrifying experiment. Just when it seemed the story of Charleston's haunted past couldn't grow darker, the nightmare deepened. If this tale chills you to the bone, share it with someone who loves uncovering the shadows of history. Tap the like button to support the channel, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next, because the true extent of Cordelia's cruelty was only beginning to unfold. It would be months before the outside world learned what took place in that hidden corner of the Ravenscraft estate. But for the 7 souls trapped there, the horror began immediately. The building chosen for Cordelia's program lay 2 miles from the main house, accessible only by a narrow path winding through thick pine forest. Once a simple tobacco drying barn, it had been transformed under her direction during the summer before the wedding. The structure now bore heavy reinforcements, barred windows placed too high to see through, locked interior doors, and cramped quarters designed to keep each person isolated. Cordelia had ordered partitions for individual confinement and an instruction room. At the center, fitted with restraints and punishment devices far beyond the cruelty even the harshest plantations practiced. The 7 victims of her design were members of the Kane family, who had lived and labored on the Ravenscraft estate for more than 30 years. Joshua and Rebecca Kane, both in their 50s, were a skilled blacksmith and seamstress. Their adult children, Samuel 28, Mary 26, and David 24, were known for their reliability and hard work. Mary's two young children, aged 6 and 9, completed the family circle. What made them particularly valuable to Cordelia was the very thing that had once made them respected among their peers: their deep devotion to one another. Her studies had convinced her that destroying such emotional bonds would yield more compliant, more productive laborers, people whose only loyalty was to their overseer's command. Her methods began with isolation. Each family member was confined to separate quarters and forbidden from speaking to the others except during supervised tasks. Mealtimes were staggered to prevent communication, and any attempt to interact led to punishment, not only for the offender but for a randomly chosen relative, sowing guilt and fear. Cordelia's cruelty extended beyond the physical. She manipulated their minds through deceit, spreading false information to erode trust and foster suspicion between family members. She would whisper lies designed to pit them against one another, setting the stage for the psychological collapse she believed would yield perfect obedience. And this was only the beginning. Cordelia's psychological manipulation soon reached new depths of cruelty. She began spreading carefully crafted lies to erode the Cain family's trust in one another. She told Joshua that his eldest son, Samuel, had criticized his father's work ethic, claiming Samuel accused him of slowing production. Meanwhile, she told Samuel that his father had personally requested harsher punishment for his supposed laziness. These falsehoods planted seeds of resentment and suspicion that slowly corroded the bonds of loyalty and affection that had held the family together through years of hardship. Her most chilling innovation, however, was a system she named productivity bonding. Under this twisted design, family members were forced to compete against one another in a series of labor tasks. Those who performed well were granted minor privileges, while those who fell behind would not only suffer punishment themselves, but cause their loved ones to be punished as well. In this way, Cordelia turned natural family devotion into a weapon of control, transforming love into a source of fear and guilt. The arrival of winter brought ideal conditions for her program. Shorter days meant longer hours of confinement, fewer witnesses, and an easier time concealing what occurred behind barred windows. Cordelia kept meticulous written logs of each subject's behavior, noting every emotional response, productivity change, and psychological collapse with the detached precision of a scientist. Her entries read less like human observation and more like the accounting records she once maintained for her father's business. The conditions inside the building were deliberately designed to inflict suffering without leaving visible marks. Cordelia knew that dead or severely injured subjects would draw unwanted attention, so she focused instead on sustained discomfort. Meals were rationed to maintain physical health, while ensuring constant hunger that she could exploit as both punishment and reward. The sleeping quarters were equally cruel. Thin straw bedding, inadequate blankets, and uneven floors ensured exhaustion and left her victims more vulnerable to mental manipulation. Throughout the bleak winter months, Cordelia made daily visits to her subjects, always accompanied by two overseers sworn to secrecy. She observed their reactions, conducted interviews to assess their mental state, and refined her methods with cold efficiency. But what she failed to recognize was that her relentless cruelty was not breaking them as intended. It was hardening them. Her victims, stripped of everything they loved, began to share a single dangerous purpose: vengeance. By February of 1823, whispers about the mysterious outbuilding and its 7 missing occupants began circulating across the main plantation. The Cain family had long been respected among the enslaved community for their skill, kindness, and unity. Their sudden disappearance, and the harsh punishment for anyone who dared mention them, created an air of dread and suspicion that spread through the quarters like wildfire. Among those most troubled by the rumors was Martha Washington, an elderly woman who had served in the main house for over 20 years. As the head cook, she was trusted by the household, allowing her to overhear fragments of conversation between Ravencraft, Cordelia, and their guests. Her respected position among the enslaved made her a confidant to many, and she quietly began piecing together the truth behind the missing family. Through careful listening and discreet questioning, Martha uncovered details that painted a picture far darker than even the cruelest plantation punishments. The two overseers assigned to the remote building had been chosen for their brutality and their lack of ties to the rest of the estate. Men unlikely to question orders or sympathize with their victims. Equally disturbing were the deliveries Martha witnessed throughout the winter months. Wagons arrived under the cover of darkness, carrying strange medical tools that seemed more suited to inflicting pain than offering care. Chains and restraints far too elaborate for ordinary discipline. And large shipments of materials suggesting long-term confinement rather than brief correction. But most haunting were the sounds that occasionally drifted through the cold night air. Some field workers swore they heard screams, agonizing cries that would echo for hours before fading into eerie silence. Others claimed that the silence itself felt worse, as if something unspeakable lingered in the void that followed. Recognizing the growing fear among her people, Martha began organizing secret prayer circles under the guise of nightly worship. These clandestine meetings became havens for emotional support and quiet resistance, allowing the enslaved community to share information, comfort one another, and plan in secret. Over time, the meetings evolved into something more, a unified force bound not just by faith but by purpose. Through whispered testimonies and careful observation, a horrifying truth emerged. What Cordelia called management innovation was in reality a campaign of systematic torture, an experiment in total psychological domination intended to erase individuality, destroy the human spirit, and manufacture obedience through suffering. The Ravencraft plantation had become a laboratory of terror, but within the shadows of its cruelty, the seeds of retribution had begun to take root. The secret prayer circles soon took on a greater purpose beyond comfort and faith. They became living archives of truth. Under Martha's guidance, members memorized every detail they could gather about the missing Kane family. What they had seen, what they had heard, and what others had whispered. Each account was passed between trusted individuals until several people carried the same story in their minds. Martha's goal was simple. Even if she or others were punished, sold, or killed, the truth would not die with them. As winter faded into spring, these meetings began to evolve. What had started as quiet information sharing slowly transformed into something far more daring. Fear gave way to resolve, and grief began to harden into anger. The realization that the Kane family's fate could easily become their own pushed many beyond the cautious silence that had long defined life on the Ravencraft plantation. For the first time in memory, enslaved workers began discussing more than how to survive. They spoke of resistance. Meanwhile, rumors about Cordelia's so-called experimental management program had begun spreading beyond the plantation's borders, though among the white community, they carried a very different tone. Neighboring plantation owners heard of her innovative techniques for improving productivity and discipline and began seeking audiences with her to learn more. Cordelia welcomed the attention. The possibility that her methods might be adopted across the region filled her with ambition and fear of failure. The Kane family was no longer merely a private experiment, they had become her proof of concept. If her subjects could be returned to the fields as fully obedient, efficient laborers, it would establish her reputation as a visionary in plantation management. But if they failed, if they displayed defiance or instability, her growing influence would collapse overnight. The coming planting season, she decided, would serve as the ultimate demonstration of her success. Yet, while Cordelia envisioned triumph, something entirely different was taking shape within the walls of her experimental building. The Kane family had indeed been transformed, but not into submissive laborers. The pain and deprivation had forged unity, not obedience. What she mistook for broken spirits were in fact sharpened minds, bound together by a shared determination to destroy the woman who had taken everything from them. The transformation began with David Kane, the youngest of the adult siblings, and once the most hopeful of them all. Cordelia had targeted him repeatedly. Believing that his natural leadership made him a threat to her control, she subjected him to isolation, starvation, and relentless humiliation meant to fracture his will. Instead, she awakened a cold, methodical intelligence. During those long months, David memorized everything: the creak of the floorboards, the timing of guard rotations, the locks left unsecured, and the placement of every tool that could serve as a weapon. Though Cordelia's system enforced strict separation among family members, David found ways to communicate through subtle signals. Taps, whispers, hidden markings, and rhythmic sounds. The Kanes kept their connection alive. Under Cordelia's nose, they developed a network of secret communication and an unspoken plan. What appeared to be submission was in truth the slow, deliberate organization of rebellion. By March of 1823, Charleston County was gripped by early warmth, and the Ravencraft plantation bustled with preparations for planting. Cordelia, eager to prove her theories, prepared for what she called the final integration. After 5 months of her psychological conditioning, she intended to return the Kane family to field labor, confident their obedience would impress the visiting planters. But the Kanes had other intentions. The breaking point came on March 15th, when Cordelia ordered her overseers to carry out the final stage of her experiment. 6-year-old Sarah, daughter of Mary Kane, was to be permanently separated from her mother and assigned to the main house. Cordelia claimed this would test whether emotional attachments had been fully erased. Mary would see her child every day, but never again be allowed to speak to her. When the overseers arrived that morning to take the child, they were met not by submission but by resistance. David Kane stood between them and his niece, calm and resolute. His defiance was not impulsive, it was rehearsed, planned, inevitable. As one overseer raised his whip, the others saw movement from every corner of the room. The Kanes had not been broken, they had been forged. What followed was not a frenzied outburst of rage, but a precise, coordinated act of vengeance. Months of planning, whispered signals, and quiet observation had culminated in this moment. The Kane family struck not as victims, but as a unit, driven by purpose, bound by blood, and resolved that death would be preferable to another day under Cordelia's rule. The Ravencraft experiment had succeeded, but not in the way Cordelia intended. She had created not perfect workers, but perfect rebels. The uprising that morning was the result of months of silent planning, careful observation, and unshakable resolve. During their long captivity, the Kane family had studied every weakness of their captors, memorized the structure of the building, and prepared themselves for the inevitable consequences of defiance. When the moment finally arrived, they were ready. The 2 overseers assigned to guard them, men well versed in enforcing submission through cruelty, were entirely unprepared for what awaited them. Accustomed to cowing individuals through pain and fear, they found themselves facing a coordinated group that no longer feared death. Within moments, both men were dead, dispatched not in blind rage, but with deliberate precision, using the very tools Cordelia had once designed for control and punishment. Yet the deaths of the overseers were only the beginning. The Kane family had not endured months of torment merely to escape. They had spent that time planning justice. Every day, they had listened to Cordelia's footsteps, memorized the rhythm of her visits, and marked the exact time she would arrive for her daily inspections. On the morning of March 15th, they knew precisely where she would be. Cordelia Ravencraft began the day with her usual routine, unaware that it would be her last. After breakfasting with her husband in the main house, she gathered her notebooks and supplies for what she proudly referred to as the final integration test. The path through the pine forest to the remote building was one she had walked countless times, her mind occupied with thoughts of success and recognition. The scent of spring blossoms mingled with the rhythmic sounds of plantation labor. The clinking of tools, the murmur of field hands, the hum of a world she believed she ruled through intellect and innovation. Confident and composed, she moved with the certainty of someone who had never encountered resistance she could not suppress through method and discipline. In her mind, the experiment had been a complete success. Her subjects had displayed the desired behavioral shifts, their wills supposedly broken and reshaped into perfect obedience. She believed this day would prove her triumph to the world. Instead, when she reached the building, she walked into a nightmare. The central instruction room, the heart of her experiment, had been transformed into a scene of meticulous horror. The bodies of her 2 overseers lay where they had fallen, their deaths executed with a precision that mirrored Cordelia's own methods. The walls bore signs of preparation. Tools reshaped into weapons, supplies rearranged for strategic use, and escape routes clearly pre-planned. What she had designed as a laboratory of obedience had been repurposed into a battleground of retribution. And standing at its center was David Kane, no longer the broken, submissive man she believed she had molded, but the embodiment of everything her experiment had failed to destroy. intelligence, resolve, and willpower sharpened into purpose. His family stood beside him, calm, aligned, and ready. "Mistress Cordelia," David said evenly, his voice stripped of all submission. "We've been waiting for you. There's something we need to discuss." What followed was not a plea or a violent outburst. It was a reckoning. The Kane family laid before her the truth of her own creation, a detailed account of her methods, her cruelty, and the consequences of what she had done. Every act of manipulation, every false experiment, every calculated cruelty had been observed, memorized, and recorded in their minds. But the purpose of their confrontation was far greater than personal revenge. The Kanes understood that Cordelia's so-called innovations were intended to spread, replicated across plantations throughout the South. Their suffering, they realized, was not an isolated act of madness but a prototype for a broader system of control. If Cordelia lived, her methods would continue. If she died without consequence, her ideas might still survive. They needed to ensure neither happened. David Kane had become something far beyond a rebellious slave. He was a strategist, a man who understood the plantation system's inner workings and how those in power would react to resistance. His plan was not merely to destroy Cordelia, but to expose her. Evidence of her experiments would have to reach sympathetic ears. People who could ensure her name became a warning, not an inspiration. The events that followed were swift and precise. By the time Cordelia's body was discovered later that day, the evidence left behind told a story that the authorities would spend decades trying to suppress. To the white community, it would be recorded as another tragic, slave uprising, its details buried in official silence. But among the enslaved, whispered across generations, it would be remembered differently, not as rebellion, but as justice. The Kane family's vengeance had gone far beyond retribution. It was the beginning of a message, a warning to those who sought to turn cruelty into science, and a testament to the resilience of those who refused to remain broken. They had meticulously compiled evidence, gathered written documentation, and established discrete connections that would guarantee their story reached beyond the local authorities. Those same officials who had every reason to protect the reputations of powerful plantation families. Colonel Thaddeus Ravencraft discovered his wife's body around 2:00 p.m. on March 15th, after her prolonged absence from the experimental site raised concern. What he found inside that isolated building would forever alter his perception of his wife, his marriage, and his family's legacy. Cordelia lay lifeless in the central instruction room, surrounded by the tangible results of the twisted project that had consumed her for the past 5 months. But what Ravencraft encountered was not the chaotic aftermath of a typical slave revolt. It was something far more deliberate, an orchestrated display of evidence that exposed, with chilling precision, the full extent of Cordelia's cruelty. The building had been transformed into what could only be described as a museum of atrocity. Every tool, restraint, and device used in her experiments had been carefully arranged and labeled, turning the site into a grim exhibition of human suffering. Her own journals, filled with observations, data, and diagrams, had been laid out alongside additional records that revealed her correspondence with other plantation owners. The presentation made it clear that this was not mere rebellion, it was a reckoning. The most disturbing discovery was a carefully written document, clearly compiled over several weeks, that detailed every aspect of Cordelia's experiments. It included her methodology, results, and future plans to expand her program across neighboring plantations. The papers revealed that what Thaddeus had believed was a private project was, in truth, the early stages of a coordinated regional effort to industrialize human control and psychological manipulation. The Kane family themselves had vanished without a trace. They had taken nothing of value, destroyed only what was necessary, and left behind an archive so detailed it would make any attempt at denial nearly impossible. Ravencraft's first instinct was not grief, it was damage control. He understood immediately that public exposure of his wife's actions would not only ruin his name, but jeopardize the entire class of Southern planters who had expressed interest in her research. Within hours, he dispatched riders to summon trusted allies, men of wealth and political influence who would understand the magnitude of what was at stake. By nightfall, representatives from some of South Carolina's most powerful families had gathered at the Ravencraft estate. Together, They examined the evidence and reached a grim conclusion. The contents of the building were so damning that a simple cover-up would not suffice. The documents implicated multiple plantation owners, suggesting collaboration and shared intent. If revealed, this would not merely destroy individual reputations. It could destabilize the foundation of the plantation economy itself. Thus began what they termed comprehensive suppression. This coordinated campaign involved local law enforcement, regional newspapers, and sympathetic officials at the state level. The official story would claim that Cordelia Ravencraft had been the victim of a random slave uprising, swiftly quelled, with all rebels captured and executed. The truth, however, would be buried under layers of lies and intimidation. Over the following weeks, the conspirators set about erasing every trace of the real events. The experimental building was dismantled, its materials burned and scattered to prevent any reconstruction of the scene. The two overseers were posthumously portrayed as loyal victims of slave violence, their complicity erased from record. As for the Kane family, official reports claimed they had been captured and executed, though no one ever saw the bodies, and no such executions were ever held. The most urgent task, however, was to destroy the Kane family's written account. Multiple copies were rumored to exist, each detailing Cordelia's correspondence and the full scale of her plans. Recovering and eliminating every copy required a multi-state effort, involving men whose own reputations would collapse if the truth surfaced. Despite these extensive measures, their suppression campaign had an unforeseen effect. By erasing the official record, they ensured that the story survived only through whispers and rumor. Passed in secret from plantation to plantation, retold in abolitionist circles and hidden journals. The Ravencraft tragedy evolved from a scandal into a legend, one that haunted Southern memory for generations. Though the cover-up prevented public exposure, it marked the beginning of the Ravencraft family's downfall. Within months, the colonel's fortune and status began to erode under the weight of secrecy and fear. By the end of the year, the once proud name of Ravencraft had become synonymous with corruption, cruelty, and shame. The first sign that their carefully constructed lie was unraveling came in late April, when anonymous letters began arriving. Letters that contained fragments of the Kane family's written testimony. Abolitionist newspaper offices across the North began receiving anonymous letters, documents filled with precise, damning details about Cordelia Ravencraft's experimental program. The material they contained could have come only from someone deeply familiar with both the inner workings of the plantation and the subsequent cover-up that followed her death. The letters were written with sophistication and clarity, clearly by an educated individual who understood how to frame information in a way that would withstand scrutiny from skeptical Northern readers. Within the pages were exact descriptions of the plantation structure, the names of overseers, diagrams of instruments used in the experiments, and most incriminating of all, direct quotations from correspondence between Cordelia and other plantation owners who had expressed interest in replicating her methods. The timing of these revelations could not have been worse for the Southern elite. The abolitionist movement was gaining unstoppable momentum, and this new evidence of systematic torture within a respected plantation family provided reformers with irrefutable proof of the cruelty embedded in the institution of slavery. In a matter of weeks, the Ravencraft affair became a central feature of Northern anti-slavery pamphlets, speeches, and public rallies. But the most catastrophic damage did not come from the North. It came from within the Southern planter aristocracy itself. Those wealthy plantation owners who had once aligned themselves with Cordelia's experimental program now found themselves cornered by suspicion. Unable to defend their association without implicating themselves, they began severing ties with Colonel Ravencraft, spreading rumors that blamed the tragedy entirely on his late wife's madness and his own supposed negligence. By the summer of 1823, Ravencraft was a pariah among his peers. The once flourishing social and business networks that sustained plantation society turned their backs on him. Banks that had once courted his favor abruptly called in debts or refused to extend credit. Merchants, who for decades had supplied him with tools and provisions on seasonal terms, now demanded immediate payment. Even neighboring planters began instructing their enslaved laborers to avoid contact with anyone from Ravencraft's estate, fearing that the plantation had become a breeding ground for dangerous ideas of defiance and liberation. The social ostracism was matched by political isolation. Ravencroft's military title, once a source of prestige and influence, became an anchor that dragged him down as political allies distanced themselves. Invitations to dinners, galas, and strategic meetings stopped arriving. Contracts dissolved without explanation. Men who had once been his closest confidants now crossed the street to avoid being seen in his company. Meanwhile, beneath the surface, the enslaved population of the region was changing. Word of the Kane family's escape and resistance spread like wildfire, igniting what Southern authorities called dangerous excitement. On the Ravencroft plantation itself, order was deteriorating. Among the enslaved, Martha Washington, the elderly cook known for leading winter prayer gatherings, had become far more than a spiritual figure. She evolved into the architect of a growing resistance network that extended across multiple plantations and into Charleston's free black community. Through this network, information flowed, details of overseer habits, weaknesses in plantation defenses, and opportunities for sabotage. What had begun as an effort to preserve the memory of the 7 tortured members of the Kane family had transformed into the first organized intelligence system of resistance in the region. The planters' worst fear was coming true. The methods, once used to control enslaved people, were now being used against them. The collapse of the Ravencroft Empire reached its breaking point in autumn 1823. A wave of coordinated uprisings and acts of sabotage spread across neighboring plantations. Overseers vanished without a trace. Equipment was found destroyed. Entire harvests were ruined in ways that suggested deliberate strategy rather than random destruction. Investigators noted with alarm that the resistance was being led by individuals who possessed intimate knowledge of plantation operations and vulnerabilities. Evidence that someone from within the system was directing a campaign to dismantle it from the inside. Desperate to maintain control, Colonel Ravencroft poured his dwindling fortune into new overseers, armed guards, and fortified outbuildings. But every new measure only fueled further unrest and drained what little capital he had left. By December 1823, the estate that had once been Charleston County's crown jewel had transformed into a militarized ruin. Guards patrolled around the clock. The enslaved were confined to their quarters outside labor hours. Suspicion and fear consumed the air, leaving productivity impossible. The cotton crop failed entirely. Livestock disappeared or were found mutilated. Buildings showed signs of intentional damage, despite the constant patrols. In the end, there was no violent climax, only the slow, relentless mathematics of financial ruin. The Ravencroft dynasty collapsed not through rebellion or retribution, but through the weight of its own corruption and the rebellion it had unintentionally inspired. Ravencroft could no longer afford the costly security measures required to keep his estate intact. Yet reducing them would have left his plantation vulnerable to the same destruction that had already consumed others across the region. Cornered by financial ruin and the certainty that his situation would only deteriorate further, he made a final, desperate decision that would complete the downfall of his family's legacy. On January 3, 1824, Colonel Thaddeus Ravencroft stood before a handful of creditors and acquaintances in the decaying parlor of his once grand mansion, surrounded by furniture soon to be auctioned off, and delivered a confession that would send tremors through South Carolina's planter aristocracy. In a moment of cold calculation, not remorse, he admitted to everything: his wife's experimental program, his role in covering up her crimes, and the involvement of others who had aided her work. This confession was not born of guilt, but of strategy. Ravencroft knew his enemies already possessed enough evidence to destroy him completely. By revealing the truth himself, he hoped to regain a fragment of control over the narrative, perhaps even to drag others down with him, those who had abandoned him after profiting from Cordelia's ambitions. In doing so, he ensured that the details of his wife's atrocities would no longer remain confined to rumor or speculation. What Ravencroft exposed was a sprawling network of collaboration, a web of correspondence and coordination that stretched far beyond his own plantation. Cordelia's experimental program, he revealed, had been conceived as a pilot project for a much larger initiative designed to implement her methods across dozens of plantations in South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama. Her innovations in psychological and physical torture were intended to become standardized tools for plantation control. Techniques so dehumanizing that rebellion itself would become impossible. The confession named names. It included dates, letters, and records identifying other planters who would offer financial backing, supplies, and moral support. Even more damning, it implicated local law enforcement and political officials, sheriffs, judges, and legislators, who had agreed to protect the program from scrutiny in exchange for access to Cordelia's management techniques. Ravencroft's revelations proved that the cover-up following her death had been a coordinated conspiracy involving falsified reports, destroyed documents, and systematic intimidation reaching into the highest levels of state authority. Yet among the many confessions Ravencroft made that day, one stood apart, something he likely never intended to make public. His investigation into the Kane family's escape had uncovered evidence showing that their resistance was far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. The 7 members of the family had not simply fled into the wilderness. They had established contact with abolitionist networks, providing them with detailed intelligence about plantation operations, security weaknesses, and economic vulnerabilities throughout the South. At the center of it all was David Kane, the young man who had led his family's uprising. Ravencroft described him as a figure of remarkable intelligence and strategic vision, an enslaved man who had mastered not only survival but organization, coordination, and psychological warfare. David's understanding of the system's inner workings had enabled him to connect isolated acts of defiance into a regional resistance network, one that extended across state lines and united enslaved individuals, freed blacks, and sympathetic Northern allies. Reports gathered by Southern authorities confirmed that the network was responsible for coordinated sabotage, failed crops, and disruptions that crippled plantations hundreds of miles apart. The Kane family's influence had evolved into something far greater than a single act of rebellion. It had become a systemic threat to the economic and psychological foundations of slavery itself. Southern officials were shaken not merely by the losses, but by what they implied, that enslaved people were now developing strategic intelligence and organizational skills previously thought impossible under bondage. The system designed to strip them of identity and willpower had instead produced minds capable of dismantling it from within. The most horrifying portion of Ravencroft's confession concerned Cordelia's true fate. Contrary to the official reports, she had not died during the initial confrontation. According to records Ravencroft later recovered and initially suppressed, Cordelia had been taken alive by the Kane family. Her captors, fully aware of her methods, subjected her to the same precise, deliberate tortures she had inflicted on others. Her final hours were spent in a calculated reversal of her own experiments, a psychological and physical deconstruction conducted with the same cold efficiency she once prided herself on. Every technique she had devised to destroy human will was turned back upon her, ensuring that she understood, moment by moment, the full magnitude of the suffering she had caused. Her death, as Ravencroft described it, was neither swift nor merciful. It was a lesson, an execution carried out with the same methodical precision she had once celebrated as scientific innovation. In the end, Cordelia Ravencroft perished not at the hands of rage-filled victims, but in the hands of those she had taught all too well how to break a human being. It was a fate that turned her legacy, and the system she had sought to perfect, into its own undoing. The use of human beings as experimental subjects for cruelty reminds us that the darkest horrors in American history were rarely born from the supernatural. They emerged from deliberate, human choices. It is when people convince themselves that some lives hold less value than others that true evil takes form. So what do you think? Was every secret of the Ravencroft plantation truly uncovered, or do hidden truths still lie buried in the archives of Charleston County? Share your thoughts below. And if you enjoyed this chilling tale, don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and share with someone who loves dark mysteries. The shadows of America's past still hold countless secrets, and together we'll keep uncovering them. The Ravencroft plantation was abandoned in February 1824. Its once grand buildings left to decay as creditors fought bitterly over assets that couldn't cover Colonel Ravencroft's mounting debts. Shortly after his public confession, Thaddeus Ravencroft vanished. Some claimed he escaped to Mexico, while others believed he ended his life, rather than face the consequences of his revelations. But the true legacy of the Ravenscroft tragedy stretched far beyond the collapse of one family's fortune. Cordelia's twisted experiments and the Kane family's defiance became lasting symbols, shaping both the abolitionist movement in the North and the evolution of plantation systems in the South. In northern states, the shocking details of Cordelia's methods provided abolitionists with undeniable proof of slavery's brutality. The Ravenscroft Confession soon became required reading in anti-slavery circles, strengthening the argument that the plantation system was incompatible with Christian morality and the American ideal of liberty. Meanwhile, the story of the Kane family's survival and escape spread among enslaved people across the South, inspiring hope where there had been none. Their successful resistance proved that freedom was possible, even under unimaginable conditions. The intelligence network established by David Kane continued long after the Ravenscroft estate crumbled, enabling escapes, coordinating acts of sabotage, and undermining the economic backbone of slavery itself. By the 1850s, plantation owners faced growing unrest that seemed too coordinated to be coincidence. Equipment failures, lost crops, and organized disappearances pointed to a deeper, deliberate resistance, one rooted in the foundations laid by the Kane family decades earlier. The Ravenscroft incident ultimately revealed a grim irony. Cruelty, meant to destroy the human spirit, had instead forged a new kind of strength. The 7 members of the Kane family, once victims of systematic torture, had become strategic thinkers capable of dismantling the very institution that had sought to erase them. In the years that followed, the abandoned plantation became a place of legend. Locals spoke of strange lights flickering in the ruins, whispered voices in the night, and shadowy figures wandering the overgrown fields, as if the past itself refused to rest. Yet the enduring significance of the Ravenscroft story lies not in its ghosts, but in its truth. It showed that the worst horrors humanity commits come not from madness, but from rationalized cruelty. The calm, deliberate evil of people who believe that suffering can be justified in the name of progress. Scattered fragments of the Ravenscroft papers, preserved in archives from Charleston to Boston, continue to shed light on how this system operated, and how those it sought to destroy learned to resist it. Historians now study these documents not just as records of atrocity, but as testimony to resilience, strategy, and defiance. Today, all that remains of the Ravenscroft plantation are crumbling foundations and a modest historical marker offering a sanitized version of its past. But for those who dig deeper, the truth still lingers in the soil where 7 enslaved people endured months of inhuman cruelty and turned their pain into the seed of a movement that would help bring the system of slavery to its knees. The tale of Colonel Thaddeus Ravenscroft, his wife Cordelia, and their wedding gift of 7 human lives stands as a lasting warning. The true horror of history lies not in monsters or myths, but in what ordinary people are willing to justify when cruelty is disguised as progress.